Plot summary of Black Diggers by Tom Wright. Black Diggers tells the complicated, intertwining stories of about a dozen made-up Aboriginal Australian soldiers during World War I. The stories are based on real archival accounts. The play doesn't tell a single story in a straight line. Instead, it uses more than 50 short stories, or vignettes, none of which are longer than a few minutes, to show the different ways Indigenous people went through, and moved on from the war, as well as to show how the war made Aboriginal soldiers feel shocked and disoriented, as well as for the world as a whole. The play, which was written for 9 male Indigenous actors, tries to show a patchwork quilt of the past, as its author, Tom Wright, put it. Black Diggers starts with a number of scenes that show how Indigenous people lived before the war and how they felt when the war started. In the remote Bellender Kerr wilderness of Queensland, the audience watches as a white taxidermist saves a young boy named Nigel from the fate of his parents, who were killed by greedy white settlers. But he only does this because Nigel is a perfect specimen. He soon shows Nigel his collection of stuffed apes at the Australian Museum, which shows how people thought of Aboriginal Australians at the turn of the 20th century. They were seen as less than human, unworthy, and unable to understand political rights. Other characters, like Harry's friends Bob, Ern, and Norm, wonder what the war is all about and if fighting in it might help them get recognized as Australians. Ern, Norm, and Bob were turned down at first because only substantially European men are allowed to join the army. They then met a sergeant who shared their doubts about this rule and signed them up. They joined the Australian military, even though an anonymous radio broadcast confirms that it sees itself as an institution of white people fighting for white Europeans against the wild Ottoman Empire forces. As the Black Diggers leave for Europe and the Middle East, their white countrymen sometimes treat them badly and sometimes welcome them with open arms. One private threatens Harry because he ate lunch with him, but the other white privates take Harry's side and beat up the racist. Because Laurie and Nigel are Indigenous, they are both sent on the most dangerous jobs. Ern knows the son of the pub owner from his hometown. When the man lights his pipe and sees that Ern is Aboriginal, he promises enthusiastically to let Ern into the front bar. In the same way, Harry becomes friends with Stan, a white soldier. Another soldier, Mick, meets 4 black Trinidadian soldiers and beats them up. The soldiers call him Australian nigger, which is funny. Bertie, who is underage and lives on his family's traditional land in New South Wales, talks his mother into making up his birth date so he can join the army. This is despite the fact that his granddad tells him he will be fighting for the same country that has oppressed his people for generations and that he will never get the equality he wants. Mick, Archie, Ern, and Stan get more and more bored and sad while fighting in the trenches on the Western Front of World War I. They have only moved 7 feet since April, leaving them with nothing to do but play I Spy. Soon, the Diggers will start to face the terrible violence that will leave permanent marks on them. Bertie and Tommy see another Indigenous soldier die and take a lock of his hair to help his soul return to Australia. Soon after, a German bomb buries them, and when they are dug out 3 days later, they are too traumatized to talk, even though they finally get to go home. One soldier, Archie, writes a series of increasingly sad letters to his Auntie May. At first, he just wishes her the best, but later, he goes into detail about a friend's failed suicide attempt, saying over and over that he doesn't have a face. In Palestine, Laurie and a British commander find comfort in the Bible. In the German Sachsenpau camp, which was made for non-white Allied soldiers, Nigel listens to a German prison guard try to convince him to switch sides by saying that Britain is unfair to him. Nigel is trying to figure out who he is as an Australian who is being mistreated by the Australia for which he is fighting. At the same time, he meets a German professor who, in a disturbing parallel to his childhood experience with the taxidermist, wants to use him as an anthropological specimen. All 3 of Norm, Ern, and Bob end up in the hospital with serious injuries. In the last scene of the first act, Archie kills a German soldier by strangling him. The soldier's last words were "Black Devil. Last thing I see." Act 2 of Black Diggers takes place many years after the war and is about what it was like for Indigenous soldiers to come back to peacetime and a country that refused to see them as people. After World War II, in 1949, an anonymous bloke with a glass of wine praises Indigenous service people, thanking God for the army for finally letting him reach his full potential. This was the same year that Indigenous service people were given the right to vote for the first time. When Mick and Archie get back to their homes in 1919, they hope that this wasn't for nothing. But it soon becomes clear that it was. Archie gets kicked out of a pub on Anzac Day, the national holiday honoring Australian and New Zealand soldiers. Even though he is wearing his war medals, a manager does let him back in later, and Mick finds out at a meeting of the Soldier Settlement Commission that the government is taking his land in Victoria's Western District and giving it to former soldiers, even though he is an Aboriginal veteran and should be allowed to keep it. Archie goes back to work on the old cattle ranch, but the conditions for Indigenous workers have gotten worse, and when he brings this up, the manager threatens the safety of his family. At a fireplace in their hometown of Cherbourg, or Baramba, Norm, who is mostly deaf, and Ern, who only has one arm, complain about their lives. "They painted my color back the day I got off that boat," says Norm. A minister gives Tommy's eulogy at his funeral, which is empty, and says that the soldier came back from the war so traumatized that he became a homeless alcoholic and no one knew about it until after he died. Ern gives away his war medals, and Bertie just spends his days holding Frank's hair and staring into space. Several anonymous letters fall from the ceiling. They talk about how the government doesn't care about the welfare of Indigenous soldiers, and the reader finds out that Harry, Laurie, and Nigel also end up like Tommy and Bertie. Harry briefly sees his old friend Stan while he is begging on Castlereagh Street in downtown Sydney. Laurie meets a fellow light horse soldier in the church where he collects him books. At first, the soldier denies that he ever fought in the war, but then he says that he thinks of another world instead of remembering this one. After the government killed Indigenous Australians at Coniston in 1929, Nigel writes an eloquent letter to a newspaper. The editors are so amazed that a darky can have such beautiful handwriting that they decide to print his letter even though they know no one will read it. In the next scene, Nigel drinks while wearing a sign for the show Tarzan the APE Man in downtown Sydney. He is once again caught in the taxidermist's paradox. He is only valued as a show, as proof of the white belief that Indigenous Australians are more like apes than men. Ern gives a long speech about the lasting effects of war, which are shown by the pieces of bullet shells he found stuck in his side after he started bleeding on his own during World War II. In the last scenes, a hymn praises God's ancient sacrifice, and the Prime Minister of Australia announces the tomb of the unknown soldier for his country. But the very last scene goes back to Nigel's story and shows his new home in 1951, a psychiatric hospital called Callan Park. He refuses to take part in Anzac Day celebrations there because, as he says, "I don't belong."
About the author. Tom Wright, an award-winning Australian playwright, grew up in Melbourne, which is the capital of the southeastern state of Victoria. He went to university to study fine art and English before becoming a full-time actor in the 1990s. Over the next 10 years, he slowly stopped acting and started writing. This is a true story. A one-man show about an American man on death row that he wrote and performed around the world was his first big hit. Since then, he has become best known for his translations and adaptations of older plays, such as The Caucasian Chalk Circle, Ball, and The Good Person of Szechuan by the German playwright Bertolt Brecht, Shakespeare's Histories, and many works of ancient Greek drama. From 2003 to 2012, he worked at the Sydney Theatre Company as an artistic associate and then as the associate director. Since 2016, he has been an artistic associate at Belvoir, another Sydney theatre company.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.